But you also pointed out yung significance of the victory of Lapu Lapu over Magellan.
Mm.
But at the same time, you also pointed out, because the plan of government, I think, is to raise him as make him a national hero.
Yeah, pero in fact I asked Rene Escalante during that meeting when I was there about the category national hero. I mean, I think officially does not really, parang does not seem, parang it does not really exist as a parang legally defined category. So, I mean, there were attempts in the past to come to a clear definition of the title national hero, but I don't think they kind of decided on that particular. So that was what Rene, because I asked Rene as to kind of, I was looking into some records years back, I think with a different case, like si Francisco Balagtas, as to whether there's such a category. And in fact, I saw some papers, National Historical Commission, about the time when they tried to resolve that issue, but they decided to kind of leave it open. They decided not, and because it creates a lot of problems once you kind of defined it. So I don't know whether, yeah, there's of course a strong push to kind of elevate Lapu Lapu to that status, like they plan to rename the international airport after him, and so on. But I'm not, I don't think they'll settle that question of who's a national hero or what's a national hero.
But for Cebuanos, well, when most Filipinos sa history books, there's really little mention, except for the fact that he defeated Lapu Lapu, won over Magellan's forces.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Yeah. I kind of, I don't think there will be a serious opposition to him receiving that honor, but this question of, like, it's a matter of symbolism. It's which often does not necessarily have to do with historical facts. It's a matter of civic symbolism. That's why I was telling Rene, because he invited me to be part of this panel that's going to settle the Limasawa Butuan question. And I was saying that to begin with, that's something that does not really interest me, like the question of the first this, the first that, and so on. But I mean, one recognizes that there will always be interest in, as well as a need for kind of, symbols like that. But the important thing is, it's just like this interest in matters of heritage. And the thing is, you don't conflate heritage with history. I mean, these are not one and the same thing. I mean, heritage, to put it simply, has to do with what people choose to remember, whereas history has to do with kind of the question of what actually happened. So heritage often has more to do with symbolism than with historical fact.
Related to that po, question about Lapu Lapu was not the one who killed Magellan, and Lapu Lapu was not a very young warrior, but an elderly chieftain. Does it really matter po?
Now, for kind of purposes of kind of remembrance, I mean, the fact is, the fact is that Lapu Lapu was the leader of the people of Maktan. I mean, the people who kind of mounted this resistance. So he does not have to be the one who actually. So it's a matter of like, it's now myth building and a matter of kind of civic symbolism, kind of where he's depicted as the one who actually kind of killed Magellan. And of course, you don't have kind of the facts to support that that was in fact what happened. But what you can assume to be a fact was that he was the one who led the resistance. So that point about I think Danny Hirona was the one who first pointed this out. That and in fact that's interesting because that's the only reference, as far as I know, that we have from the primary accounts of what Lapu Lapu looked like, because is that reference to the fact that he was very old. Now, that's kind of interesting because that's the first reference to his physical appearance, that he was very old. Although you can't say kind of with absolute certainty that in fact that statement is factual, because it's if I remember correctly, that appeared in an account by, I think, Gaspar Correa, who was a chronicler, based on he was supposed to have talked to survivors of the expedition. So that would make it plausible, but of course you can think of a number of arguments to in a sense cast doubt on that. But anyway, the fact that he was old would mean that he was not in the battle himself, but he clearly was the one who led it and directed it and so on. So as a matter of symbolism, you can allow it to pass that was the way it was the way it's romanticized, but as a question of history, kind of you don't really have kind of can't really be definite about because how would they know?
So you don't. So if we take it as the closest description or documentary, the description of Lapu Lapu as an elderly person, you don't really have to change the statue to look like the description made by, kung symbolism lang po ang pinag-uusapan, because it symbolizes the Filipino as a warrior at the time.
So that's why kind of making that distinction between kind of matters of heritage as against matters of history. They each serves a different. They're not. It's not that they're unrelated, because we kind of as much as possible, kind of matters of heritage have to be grounded in history. But it's the point is you also have to distinguish between one and the other, because they kind of kind of the purposes are not exactly the same. You know?
Okay, sir, as the chairman also said that the commemorations will focus on three things. One is the victory of Lapu Lapu in Maktan. The second is the circumnavigation.
Yes.
And the third one, which will be led by the church, is the
Baptism.
baptism.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
But the government's focus will be on the victory of Maktan.
Yeah.
For the present, the generation, today's generation, what lessons will be taught? Imparted to them with the commemoration in 1521. Meron po bang lessons from history and that?
Yeah, kind of, you know, the idea about kind of the significance of the battle. It's, of course, something that is taken in terms of like, you know, resistance to invaders, kind of desire to preserve kind of freedom, kind of that kind of so that in a sense kind of would be the kind of the essential lesson to be drawn from and I think it was the kind of the writer and historian Nick Joaquin who kind of made a reference to the fact that one value to the celebration of Lapu Lapu and the Battle of Maktan is that kind of in terms of kind of historical commemorations, kind of we kind of don't have too many that kind of celebrate a victory. Like mostly it's kind of like fall of Bataan, kind of. So that's in a sense what makes the Battle of Maktan, in a sense, attractive as a symbol because it shows, you know, a native warrior kind of vanquishing an invader. You know? So I mean that's kind of, in a sense, the narrative that the commemoration is meant to convey. So kind of, you know, the focus is on that lesson, and the thing with the commemorations is that kind of tends to gloss over the inconvenient details or facts in the story, because as I kind of mentioned in that essay, kind of probably the kind of the local politics involved in behind the battle is probably the more kind of probably closer to the historical fact than kind of the later kind of meanings attributed to the event. But kind of that's something that kind of you don't really kind of focus on, because kind of it diminishes the significance of the event.
Yes, because you also pointed out, sir, that Lapu Lapu was actually willing to submit to the king, but he refused to recognize the appointment of Mabon as the king's representative.
Yeah, that's kind of an inference you can make, because I think what's important is to kind of situate it in the context of kind of warfare, you know, in the conduct of warfare in pre-colonial times, you know, kind of, and so like with reference to Southeast Asia in general, kind of much of politics was really to do with alliance building. I mean, you build alliances, kind of. So it's not like kind of the aggressive kind of European style of warfare where you annex territory and so that like I mean, one raises the, like, if for instance Magellan had struck up an alliance with Lapu Lapu instead, Lapu Lapu probably, in lower likelihood, probably would have acceded, no? But so it's kind of the interesting thing there for a historian with respect to the Battle of Maktan is, one is trying to imagine why Lapu Lapu decided to go into battle, you know, because that's, as I said in the article, in the context of Southeast Asian warfare, kind of the more common response would be to avoid the confrontation. You know? Yeah. I mean, in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, and specifically in the Philippines, like a very kind of common occasion for warfare is slave raiding. You know, it is a kind of, I mean, it was not conquest of territory, because why would one be interested in the territory? There's kind of a lot of land, and in fact, the primary resource that a leader would have would be the number of people he has, because land is plentiful. I mean, why would one kind of fight over land? So the important thing would be to enlarge one's following, to kind of sustain, because that's the kind of important source of prestige and power, so that they would not kind of want to go into battle which would be costly in terms of loss of manpower. Like, so as what happened, like when Legazpi came, what they did was they mounted some resistance, but very quickly withdrew and went up to the hills. Isn't that right? Kind of, because the form there was like kind of the ones who would invade would be interested in booty, and particularly slaves. And once they have them, they would also leave. They would not, like, in a sense, conquer territory. They would like get even what was for booty. So, of course, in the case of the Magellan, what I think was, in a sense, somewhat unprecedented, strange, a new experience, was that it seemed like they were here to stay, right? And so they were not kind of, unlike the raids that they were probably familiar with. I mean, they would happen very quickly, and so the raiders would disappear, and you can go back to the settlement to rebuild the houses that have, so kind of, so, and also kind of, so that's what I was kind of trying to kind of imagine as to why did Lapu Lapu decide to mount, because a kind of fixed frontal combat that's not typical Southeast Asian warfare. It's hit and run, it's ambush, it's a quick raid. I mean, they don't do European style where you have like two armies in frontal combat. So I mean, there are many factors, kind of. To begin with, kind of, Maktan was something that one could not quickly give up and abandon because of its strategic value in terms of, which is kind of the important thing at the time. I mean, the control of trade that came to Cebu, and Maktan is strategically positioned to be able to control the trade. And in fact, that was the feud between Humabon and Lapu Lapu. Even before Magellan appeared on the scene, it was control of the port. So to begin with, Maktan was not an easy location to give up. And the other hand, of course, there's kind of the fact that it's a small island. I mean, probably like in the case of the settlement of Cebu, you can go up to the hills and wait until the enemy leaves. So, and probably like, so it was not kind of, and of course the Spaniards control the waters. So, and then, so again, a number of you can imagine a number of factors why Lapu Lapu was put in a position where he had to mount, and I think he figured kind of, I mean, people were very rational in their calculations as to what their chances of success are. And they probably figured that kind of, this is kind of rushing into battle that he had. So it's interesting to imagine, like, kind of, for instance, did Lapu Lapu know exactly what the plans of the Spaniards were? And so it's very likely that he had people who were kind of spying on, and so, and the way he kind of he conducted the battle, I mean, he clearly kind of, in a sense, outwitted Magellan, because kind of on the other hand, it's interesting because Magellan seemed to have been seized by a kind of delusion of grandeur, that kind of, which of course was in many ways typical of Europeans at that time, that they felt kind of, they were filled with a sense of their own superiority, that, one of their soldiers who is equivalent to like probably 100 natives, but I think it was completely kind of, and that I think is what's kind of remarkable about how Lapu Lapu fought in terms of he clearly knew that kind of that the ships of Magellan were of no use because they're out of range, isn't that right? And he had control of the terrain, kind of. In fact, he engaged in a delaying tactic, so he would kind of wait until what was the right time to initiate the combat. So kind of the terrain was really worked against the Spaniards. So he kind of Lapu Lapu kind of fought a much more intelligent battle than kind of Magellan did.
Another question, which, as you pointed out in your article, in your introduction, was after the battle, si Lapu Lapu virtually disappeared from the accounts. Was this because he knew that sooner or later the Spanish would come back, and
yeah. But the thing is, we don't know exactly what happened to him, kind of after the battle. But what we know is that when 40 years later the Spaniards came back, kind of, they found Maktan practically depopulated, so probably like kind of but we have no idea that at all as to what became of Lapu Lapu. It's possible that, particularly if you think that he was already kind of an old man, probably was dead already when Legazpi came back. Although the popular accounts are very interesting, because kind of the stories about how he went back to Borneo and so on. So they've constructed a whole narrative of his story. But this is what you have in the popular, in the oral tradition and the popular histories.
Sir, yung impact on indigenous society by by the arrival and subsequently the occupation
Mm.
of Cebu and later on
Mm.
South Luzon by the Spaniards.
Mm.
Ano po ba, based on your studies, ano po ang major, if we can call it that way, impact on society at that time?
I think the first kind of impact was like not just Magellan but later Legazpi. I think first decades of the Spanish presence were highly unsettled and probably like kind of there's a great deal of dislocation of population, so that the reality that was the case with respect to Maktan. Maktan was practically depopulated, but I think in the case of Cebu in general, because kind of again the primary response of, in a sense, the natives to the European presence was avoidance. I mean, they kind of, so they decided to kind of, after all, it was kind of, it was, people are very mobile at that time. I mean, like kind of, they kind of can move, from place to place. So they feel like kind of, they feel it was not advantageous to be where the Spaniards were. I mean, it was the most logical response would be just the response of flight, evasion, avoidance. That was the first response. So that kind of, the thing is, it really took a long time for things to, in a sense, kind of settle down, and for the Spaniards to establish effective control. Because to begin with, kind of the Spanish presence was very thin, so the impact must not have been that, in the sense, kind of that kind of great in terms of like probably think of the first century of the Spanish presence, because the population just kind of moved, so it probably kind of took some time before kind of, a kind of a new colonial order was, I mean, one sees that also if you think in terms of, which was something I tried to do, like do a history of the devotion to the Santo Niño. So like when exactly that devotion kind of became like kind of popular devotion in terms of scale, participation, and so clearly that it took a long time, kind of. So because if you say like, when does a popular devotion to an image like that of the Santo Niño, how does it develop? To begin with, you need to have people. if you don't have, you need to have like a participation of a large number of people. That's what makes a devotion real. So like, so you look at like population in Cebu at the time, kind of, and to be able to create a really impressive devotion, you need resources, in terms of like funding the ceremonials, kind of all the kind of what goes into like kind of creating an impressive fiesta kind of celebration. So, and so kind of clearly that took time. In fact, some would say that it's probably only at the beginning of the 19th century that it really kind of became a devotion of some scale, and with a reputation that attracted devotees from the surrounding islands. That probably came about only started in the early part of the 19th century, because it coincides also with the development of Cebu itself as a city or as a province. So kind of increased prosperity in Cebu came about only at the beginning of the 19th century. So there was, in many ways, very little going on in the first 2 centuries of Spanish rule. No? So.
What would, because on the other hand, you have the sultanates developing in Mindanao and Sulu.
In?
Sa Mindanao.
Yeah.
What would, ano po ba how would you, why would they were able to resist the Spaniards? But on the other hand, yung settlements dito sa Visayas up to Luzon were relatively weaker in terms of organization and ano po ba pag medyo
kind of I mean, studies of like what the polity was like in Cebu, like anthropologists would, in fact, there's, I think the most substantial study that has been done of what they call chiefdoms, you know, because kind of anthropologists would use chiefdom as kind of the more precise kind of title for, this is the polity at the time. And so they kind of, what we know of like pre-colonial Cebu is that it was on its way to becoming I can't remember now, like kind of there's a thrill, I'm referring to this study by what's her name, Laura Juncker, about Philippine chiefdoms. And
it's in your
I kind of I cited that kind of there's what is there's like a simple chiefdom, and then kind of she distinguishes kind of 3 levels. So, or like what is also referred to like Cebu was like a super barangay. It was not, or it was a complex. It was I think she used the word complex chiefdom, and complex in the sense that there's a 3-level structure, meaning you have a chief who had under him lesser chiefs who also had under them kind of a following. So there are kind of a 3-level structure. So and that Cebu at the time of Spanish contact was already kind of developing into a complex chiefdom, meaning like Humabon, he was the kind of the highest chief he had like kind of lesser chiefs with their own kind of followings kind of under him, and so you have a kind of a 3-level structure. So so you have like Humabon, and then the secondary chiefs who may have after them even like smaller kind of village chieftains. So I mean that's what you call a complex chiefdom, but but it's a very kind of in a sense, it's a very fragile and fluid configuration because kind of depending on a number of factors, the chiefs under you can easily secede and allied with other chiefs. So kind of it's a very unstable and a very fluid configuration because kind of it's founded on kind of exchange of commodities, patronage, kind of charisma, and so on. So I think the one difference probably if you kind of the sultanates or a much more were kind of as political structures tighter and stronger. And to begin with, you have kind of the authority conferred by a big religion, the Islam, you know, and I mean, Cebu, by all accounts, was not a Muslim sultanate, you know. So in that sense, kind of, yeah, in many ways, you know what we can say about Mindanao, kind of. Mindanao was, I mean, of course, we think of Mindanao now as the country's back door, but that was the front door, you know, in pre-colonial times. In many ways, that was the most developed part of the archipelago, chiefly because of its proximity, of course, to the rest of Southeast Asia, and kind of the introduction of Islam in Mindanao. So that was really kind of the country's front door. So in the sense, you have their kind of more developed, kind of stronger polities than, say, in the case of Cebu. No? So and also the thing with Cebu is that it really survives because of kind of trade and alliances. Doesn't really have much of a resource base of its own. You know, it's not like kind of, and that's why like kind of the Spaniards quickly abandoned it because of and they moved to Panay, and eventually because the problem with Cebu is much more vulnerable to, like when the Portuguese blockaded Cebu. And in fact, the Cebuanos themselves tried to starve out the Spaniards because kind of Cebu doesn't have the resources to kind of support a large kind of parasitic population like a Spanish because it's kind of doesn't really have the resource base, you know. It's really dependent on like for food and other things to other supplies from other islands. So it's easy to kind of blockade it and starve out and that's why like kind of that's the reason why the Spaniards abandoned Cebu for Panay and eventually for Luzon.
Yeah.
But the other, I think, important thing with respect to the quincentennial, and I think I mentioned this to Rene, is to, in a sense, kind of insert it into the story of globalization, because in many ways, you know, the kind of this, the era of kind of discovery, you know, Magellan, kind of the discovery of the New World. I mean, that's a period they call kind of early globalization, the time of early globalization. And so that's why I was saying that, well, kind of for the quincentennial, like if you want to generate interest, particularly in the people that you need for mounting the celebration, like business sector and so on, they're not really interested too much in the history itself, but kind of. But you see, you have to link it up with something that probably more current, like the whole phenomenon of globalization, and because you can in a way argue that this is where it all began.
Yes, yes. Regarding that point po, most people or those who teach history, the what happened in Maktan, don't really connect it to the why the Spaniards were here in the first place. Parang may disconnect po. I don't know if I'm correct. Maybe it has to do with you need to be able to link it to what was happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah. I think the one great, in a sense, symbolic, and not just symbolic fact about the Magellan expedition is the circumnavigation. And that's kind of, and in the sense of like globalization, kind of, that's in a sense the core idea. You see that kind of the circumnavigation. That's the core. That's the core idea. So so if you think about the circumnavigation, what happened in Cebu was really a kind of, in a sense, a major event, because in certain ways, like if you think about like the circumnavigation having been completed by Sebastian Elcano, when kind of the remainder of the expedition found its way back to Spain, and you can say that's true, but in many ways it's really anticlimactic, isn't that right? Kind of in a sense, literally that's where it was. You can think of it as it was completed, but in other respects, like probably in more kind of substantive terms, kind of when kind of the important thing about like Maktan is that was where, in a sense, the story was in certain ways completed with the death of Magellan, and a good case can be made out of the fact that that the circumnavigation was effectively completed when Magellan with Magellan, because like Magellan was already in this part of the region 10 years before. Is that right? When he was in Malacca 10 years before, and although we don't have a specific reference to his having been in Philippine waters, but that's very highly likely, because we know it's a fact that when he was in Malacca, he was already, in a sense, kind of exploring the area, that he probably like kind of came to Philippine waters, or even like landed in Mindanao 10 years earlier. But the point is, substantially, when he came to the Philippines, he was already in this part of the world where he already was. 10 years ago, he had already circumnavigated. So there are historians who kind of argue that point that, in a sense, the circumnavigation had already been completed. And that's also like kind of the story about this Malay slave Enrique. So the case of like, but I would favor the idea that effectively kind of Magellan kind of was the first circumnavigator, that he already and unless you want to be kind of quite literal, that this was the specific point where he was. Yeah, but that's kind of going too literal. But the point is, he was already in more or less that part of the, in that part of the region. He had already been in probably Borneo, had been to Borneo or pine in the waters of Mindanao. So this is more or less, he was already back to where he was 10 years before. You know? And the fact that he was the head of the expedition. Yeah? So like to credit Elcano with being the first circumnavigator, well, that would be kind of a very literal interpretation, but in a sense, kind of, you know.
Are we making that case? Are we making that case? I mean,
yeah.
That Magellan actually could be considered as
Yeah. So in a kind of substantive way, I think you can credit him with having been the first to circumnavigate. And the thing about like kind of Enrique, but again, that's the thing is, it's like kind of also the question of Lapu Lapu being the one who killed Magellan because he was the head of. So the fact that Magellan was kind of the head of the expedition, you know, I mean, it's a rather minor point that kind of it's Elcano because he was the one who kind of survived and brought back. But I would tend to believe that kind of Magellan had a stronger claim to having been kind of done the first circumnavigation of the world. So that in fact the story of the Magellan expedition is that it really climaxed with the death of Magellan. After that, kind of in a sense, everything was anticlimactic, right? So I mean, this was really the high point. Because like kind of after the massacre in Cebu, kind of they burned one of the ships, kind of I think somewhere between Cebu and Bohol, because they no longer had enough men to man the three, because there were three ships that. How many? There were 5, no, when they started, and only by the time they entered Philippine waters and came to Cebu, the 5 had been reduced to 3. And then after the massacre in Cebu, they decided to scuttle or burn one of the ships, so they were left with just 2, and that was the 2 ships that found their way to the Moluccas, but kind of they were like kind of in a sense already the remnants of the expedition. In many ways, leaderless. They had those leaders. So like the events taking place after Cebu seemed like kind of this kind of anticlimactic, and they find one of the vessels eventually found its way back to Spain.
Are we going to raise this officially?
Yeah.
That Magellan actually was the one who first circumnavigated the world.
I mean that's going to be debated, but I mean, like a lot of historical questions is not a matter of like, I mean, who would like officially declare that? So it's because in many ways like a political issue. The thing is you don't. In many ways, like historical questions are not resolved by official decree. It doesn't mean that it will continue to be debated, isn't it, right? So, kind of, if it's kind of done officially, it's again for the purpose of like commemoration and kind of but I think there are kind of historians who kind of would, although I think, probably like kind of, officially Elcano would be as, but I think a lot of historians would say that, in substantive terms, kind of Magellan can be considered to have been the first to circumnavigate, and he deserves the honor much more than kind of Elcano. Because there's also, I think, politics involved there, because Magellan was not popular in Spain, and he kind of, they blamed him for what kind of the disaster of the expedition and so on. So
there's really quite a lot to discuss about
yeah.
what happened
Yeah.
and so many things about relatives of Magellan now claiming that no, Lapu Lapu pala.
Yeah.
There's even one, sir, who claims to have title. They belong to a royal family related to this Taliano family. Have you heard about them?
No, no, but the thing is, I mean, there are claims like that about like, and I mentioned, I gave some names in that article, like the Baring family, the Igot family, they claim kind of direct descent. But how do you prove that? So that's something you can't really. I don't think you can kind of prove that. So because you don't have kind of the thing is like as I mentioned, like Opon or Lapu Lapu has actually oldest parish records in the whole province, but the records there begin only like I think early 1700s. So you can probably, if you need documentary proof, like trace genealogy back to the early 1700s, but you can't do it anymore. And so you're left with what? Almost like 200 years that you can't quite document. You can't quite document. So that's the matter of like, and also like even like in the case of kind of Maktan itself. I mean, there are many stories of like Biliran in Leyte. They have a oral tradition about like that was where Lapu Lapu lived, and or you have stories about northern Cebu, and but all these stories, even Negros. I think all these stories come from the fact that there was a scattering of the population at the time Legazpi came. So, which means that these stories or traditions about like the people people of Maktan kind of moved to Leyte or Negros, and so that kind of is plausible because there was a kind of dispersal of the population at the time. So.
Is it correct to assume that usually po sa barangay or the place, they're all in a way related?
Who?
Yung settlements before po, the people in a place more or less are related to each other. Pwede tama po yun?
Yeah. Yeah.
That their families that came from another place and
Yeah.
more or less related to each other.
except that if the if you think about like a place like Maktan, for instance, that's why the story about that the Lapu Lapu originally came from Borneo, and then one story has it that after the Battle of Maktan, he eventually kind of decided to go back to Borneo. That's the kind of the popular in the tradition, which I think is interesting, but it speaks as well of as I said, the population then was highly mobile. If you are engaged in trade and so on, so in fact, like there's a study about here in Cebu, kind of based on archaeological records. And it says that like certain, it was common for people then, like for certain times of the year they would be here. At other times they would be, depending on the season, they would be somewhere else. So, I mean, the fact is that's characteristic of a maritime population, which you know, the Visayans were kind of they moved around a lot, depending on where the trade opportunities were, depending on the season of the year, where kind of in a sense the food supplies would be plentiful. So kind of they were highly mobile. That's why like one story about Lapu Lapu is that this reference to that he was orang laut, which is kind of literally like people of the sea. So, and although as I mentioned, I think in the article, kind of, that's not really too helpful because because practically almost like everyone was orang laut, you know, kind of, and these were people who kind of more or less kind of spent more of their time on the sea than on land, you know, and so because they were not kind of, I mean, even like Maktan today, I mean, kind of the people there can't live off agriculture. I mean, the nature of the island is that there's not much agriculture there to begin with. So it's really fishing and trading and raiding, in a sense, kind of like because it's not just like trading, but also interdicting the incoming piracy, what you would call piracy. That's kind of the economy of the time. You know, they lived off piracy. So you had there's a great deal of kind of movement, of people moving around. You know.
I'd like to ask more questions, Kel. I'm sure you have.
No.
Yung pong, as you pointed out earlier, you said that what was important at that time was people.
Yeah.
It's not really the land.
Yeah.
When did land become important for insofar as became
I think it kind of that already came about during the Spanish period. You know, but land in the sense of like, but in the case of Maktan, you can say that location is very important. But not so much because of kind of the land, but kind of location in relation to the where trading was going on. So that, like, if for instance piracy was kind of a prevailing economic system, it was an economic system in pre-colonial times in I think much of insular Southeast Asia, where kind of slave raiding was a major kind of practice. Because kind of it was manpower that was valuable and in short supply. So just kind of, you had kind of a lot of land, but who's going to work the land? I mean, you don't have. So that was what fueled slave raiding as an economic system in Southeast Asia. So and then. Then control of trading routes was very important. You know, it's like kind of later on, like kind of. I mean, that's the case also with the Portuguese. You know, because somebody has said that Portuguese maintained what is called like a shadow empire, because the Portuguese were not also interested in control of land. Their empire was in a sense constituted of a network of ports. They would like garrison certain, so it was control of strategic points in navigation and trade. No, so now the Portuguese were interested in land so much as the control of where the key strategic points were. So they had like kind of a shadow empire. It was different in the case of the Spaniards, who kind of were into like conquest and control of territory. So in the case of like Maktan, I mean, so as I said earlier, like the importance of Maktan was really because if you are based there, you can control the incoming kind of, in the case of like interdicting kind of the incoming vessels. So instead of going to Cebu, they would already be kind of stopped as they enter the channel.
The pay tribute.
So that's kind of what made Maktan important, and that's why like the story is that there was already this running feud between Maktan and Cebu, between Lapu Lapu and Humabon, before the Spaniards appeared. So like what happened was that kind of Magellan stepped right into the middle of this feud. Mm.
Yung po, Santo Niño, religion,
Yes.
ano po role, well, they said that the Spaniards conquered through the sword and the cross. And they used the religion as a way of subjugating native population.
Yeah.
In your study of
Yeah, kind of evangelization as a kind of an important part of Spanish conquest. But this was exactly, I think, the case in the Magellan expedition, because the Magellan expedition was supposed to be exploratory, kind of finding what the best navigation routes were, and then kind of trade was the kind of, it was trade that was the primary motive, and kind of exploring the territory. So and that's why like kind of Magellan was severely criticized by the Spanish crown for what he did in Cebu. In fact, the story is that one of the subsequent expeditions, I can't remember now which one, Villalobos expedition, because there were like the expeditions that came after, there were 2 or 3 before the Legazpi expedition itself, that there's the historical reference to how, in fact, I can't remember whether it was the Villalobos expedition, had in fact a message from the Spanish king, kind of apologizing for what Magellan did, and saying that Magellan, that's not supposed to be what Magellan, the instructions of Magellan to, because I think the other mysterious thing about the Magellan story is to kind of, why did he decide to stay on in Cebu or the Philippines and concern himself with baptizing natives and becoming involved in the politics of the, when
he was just supposed to pass.
it was just the whole idea was to find their way to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas. In fact, that was what caused discontent within the expedition, in the crew. And that's why, like, when Magellan, part of that story is that when Magellan decided to go to Maktan to, in a sense, teach these natives a lesson, he had with him, in a sense, he had with him some historical concept like cabin boys and so on, because the others refused to, like the real soldiers in the expedition refused to go with Magellan, because they were all already at that time kind of grumbling as to what are we doing here, you know, kind of, that was not what they were after. And so it was kind of the stories of the expedition usually deal with that question of like what exactly was Magellan thinking about, you know, kind, because what they were expected to just like pass through, you know, and they would like probably like reconnoiter the islands, kind of establish kind of friendly relations with the natives, get supplies for the, but the whole aim was to get to the Moluccas. That was the whole aim. So what were they doing, kind of, you know, getting involved in local politics and kind of baptizing? That was not really what the expedition was about. And that's why, like, kind of the king apologized for the behavior of Magellan because he said that that was not the instructions of the royal court for the, so I mean kind of getting into a battle with so in a sense, kind of they were not supposed to like engage in evangelization, you know, at the time. They, you know, the opportunity probably presented, especially like, but that was not really the whole. Evangelization would become an important rationale for later. But in the case of the Magellan expedition itself, that was not really the important aim. And this is interesting. Like, and I raised that point about the baptism itself, the reason why, like, kind of, in fact, Humabon kind of decided to have himself baptized, was it mainly, he thought, because kind of it's part of cementing the alliance, you know. So, so it's not, of course, what's going to be celebrated today, kind of beginning of Christianization and so on. But I think the reality was that it really was not a real baptism or kind of, you know, and so I mean, why would they kind of, and it was kind of a kind of mass baptism where the chief decides to get baptized, everybody under him would be baptized as well. But exactly what did they had in mind when they, I mean, what did baptism mean at the time? So I think it would be more plausible to think of a baptism as important for purposes of cementing an alliance. And that was, I'm certain, what Humabon had in mind as well. That was kind of, because he now had kind of, as an ally, you know, a powerful person who, in fact, like, and what created the problem was that kind of Magellan wanted everybody else to obey him. And in the case of the reality at that time was that, I mean, it's a notion of authority that probably was foreign to them, because the nature of a chiefdom is like kind of, it's not a case of like kind of where everybody else has to be loyal to. It's kind of a transaction. It was transactional, but each chief was relatively free to live. You know, if he decides to leave this Humabon and kind of put himself under a different, you know, yes. So the idea of Magellan like laying down the law that everybody else has to obey this, that was kind of foreign to them. Because he was, in a way, it's like Humabon was just acknowledged to be like, in a sense, the kind of like a primus inter pares. He was the kind of the biggest among in a sense equals, because each chief enjoyed relative autonomy. It's not a case you're binding yourself for always with a leader. It's because it's a kind of, you know. So that's the nature of the alliances being kind of very unstable.
One last question.
Yeah.
Going back to linking the circumnavigation to, or inserting globalization sa commemoration. How would you do that during the commemoration?
During
How would you expound on that? What happening right now?
Yeah, kind of. In a sense, it can be, you know, if you want kind of a serious discussion to take place during the celebration, it will be an occasion to think about globalization itself as a phenomenon, and that means you are marking an event that the significance of which extends to the present time. Is that right? So, and the thing with globalization, kind of, it's not kind of an unmixed blessing, or you can say, so it's. That's why I like in the article that I wrote, I found interesting this story. And actually I owe that to this book entitled The Magellan Fallacy by an American scholar named Adam Lifshitz. Although he's dealing with the kind of more like the literature of the, but he discovered a Cebuano manuscript, short stories. So it's quite interesting. And one of the stories there is, and it's a short story by a Cebuano writer, he discovered the manuscript, so it's unpublished. But one interesting story there is, this writer wrote it in the 1930s. So this was written in the 1930s about how Lapu Lapu kind of, in a sense, appeared in Maktan Part kind of the stories that he had been kind of, for what he did, he had been kind of exiled to the planets and so on. And now was, for the first time, was returning to Maktan. So and then in fact, in the story, Magellan himself also comes back to life, kind of, yeah, comes back to visit Maktan, and they actually met. Yeah. Anyway, like the story is that like kind of Lapu Lapu, so returned to Maktan, and then marveled at the progress that had been made. Yeah. Because in the 1930s, this was a big coconut oil mill in Maktan, kind of, and he was impressed by how the streets were nicely paved, the houses were good looking, and there was this kind of big industrial complex, and then it was filled with kind of feelings of regret, that kind of the idea that kind of he had, this progress would have come sooner had he not killed Magellan. And then he listened to these young people who were speaking in a language he could no longer understand. They were probably like talking in English because it's already American era. And so you're saying that kind of he had fought to defend, you know, integrity of local culture and so on, and yet so he was kind of having doubts as to whether he did the right thing. So, and it's interesting because he was walking kind of in Lapu Lapu, and as an open in Maktan, and he met Magellan, who also was visiting, and Magellan said that he was going to see his shrine in Maktan, you know. So these two ghosts from the past meeting. And so like, it has to do with the kind of the ambivalence that one has with respect to, like, I mean, the whole issue of like kind of Western progress, globalization, kind of, because this is, the thing about Lapu Lapu also is that, which people now are not really aware of, that when, I mean, the first Lapu Lapu monument was erected only in 1933. That's rather late, no? But of course, like, Lapu Lapu started to become a hero after the Spanish period. Of course, because during the Spanish period, he was the villain. He was the person who killed Magellan, so he was, of course, he was the villain. So, in a sense, Lapu Lapu starts to become a hero, at least in the popular kind of national imagination, only during the American period. So in 1917, the local government of, I think, Cordoba, I think, opened, wanted to build a monument to Lapu Lapu, because they were saying that, you know, there's a wonderful, impressive shrine to Magellan, but there's none for Lapu Lapu. And so they started a fund drive to build this monument. I'm curious, like, although the sources, there are gaps in the sources, I can't quite get into the details of the story. But the monument itself, which is the monument in front of the City Hall, and not the old municipal hall of Lapu Lapu. That's the first monument where he's, what is it, carrying a pestle. Was built only in 1933. So I assume that the reason is that why it took so long was that there was actually an active resistance to building the monument to Lapu Lapu. And that's why probably like they were not able to raise the money because 1917, and it was only in 1933 that it was built. And then I came across these references to how kind of the Catholic Church was against the building of the monument, and the still kind of mga Spanish, the Hispanistas in in Cebu, even kind of outside Cebu, were also against this building a monument to Lapu Lapu. In fact, the interesting account that I read was that they were saying that kind of interesting that that they would criticize Lapu Lapu as an American-made hero, in the sense that the reason why there was this move to honor Lapu Lapu, and this was 1917, no? Was that the Americans wanted the focus to be on the Spaniards as the villain instead of the Americans, who after all had killed many Filipinos during the Philippine-American War. So they divert the attention from American atrocities to the Spanish kind of misdeeds. So he was criticized by the initiative was criticized by the Hispanistas, the Spanish loyalists, as well as the Catholic hierarchy. Because why would they? Because of course, on the part of the Catholic hierarchy, honor a man who delayed the introduction of Christianity by 44 years. No, so I mean, why would you honor the man who kind of prevented the introduction of Christianity? So that, and the reason for that I can see is that the early 20th century, that time, 1917, around that time. That was when there was a great deal of anxieties in the Catholic Church, the Catholic hierarchy, because of the entry of the Protestants, kind of, and so on. Parang the secularization of society, kind of. So that was the time when the church was feeling beleaguered by, by the changes taking place under the Americans. So nobody remembers that now, that the move to honor Lapu Lapu was controversial, and that there were people who were opposed. There were people who were opposed to honoring Lapu Lapu. I mean, why honor this fellow who kind of delayed the introduction of Western progress and Christianity by so many years? So it's interesting, kind of the politics there is interesting.
The Lapu Lapu monument po sa Maktan Shrine, the one in front of the Magellan, later pa rin na yun.
Yeah, that was Marcos period.
Marcos period na yun.
Yung sa Maktan Shrine, that's
the one you're mentioning is the one with the pestle, but according to what story I read, it used to be a bow. Yeah. But 3 mayors now died.
One after the other. Yeah. That's the story.
They changed
Yeah.
to a pestle.
Yeah. And original was like kind of bow and arrow. The arrow is kind of pointed at the municipal hall, and that's why when 3 mayors, one after the other, died, kind of they said that the jinx because of the so they kind of changed it to a pestle, and which is kind of an interesting story in itself, because I'm still trying to find out as to why of all things a pestle, that was the weapon that killed Magellan, was a pestle. Kind of rather strange, kind of, and because that's the kind of the folk tradition that was Lapu Lapu's magic weapon, was a pestle. But I was asking around, like, kind of, are there other stories like in the Philippines, or perhaps even like in Southeast Asia, where the pestle is a weapon? And apparently, there are references to it. I think mainly parts Indian tradition. sa Indian tradition, yung the pestle as a weapon. So because it's supposed to be appearing like kind of Ramayana, parang mention of a pestle, but I've not come across. But it's something interesting to look at as to whether there's, because why of all things a pestle? Parang it doesn't seem like but it clearly has parang I mentioned that in the article because sa story sa Maktan there's a reference to the pestle is made of the bianti wood, bianti, and which I parang it seems strange, kind of. I asked around, like people don't know. And eventually, I discovered that bianti, after all, is a name for it's actually more like a shrub. It's a small tree. It's like it's a tree, but more like also called a shrub, and it's a small tree, parang soft wood. Why bianti? Parang it doesn't seem like the type of wood that you would use for. It's just a soft wood. It's a white soft wood. And then I suddenly parang I realized, because I came across the reference to the bianti wood as sometimes used in sorcery. So may magical associations with sorcery, because parang it seems strange that if you think of pestle, it has to be hardwood, no? Pero it's a soft wood, probably used for like firewood or but apparently there is a magical properties attached to it, so which would kind of jibe with parang the idea of it being used as a magic weapon. So that's why, like, kind of the politics of symbolism is interesting. Which of course continues until today, because like kind of one of the primary I think the most supporter of Lapu Lapu as a national hero is Duterte. He announced that even before he assumed, when he won as president, before he actually assumed office, and he was interviewed, and of course he was interviewed by kind of journalists here from Cebu who went to Davao because he had just won the election. And he mentioned that one of the things he would do when he becomes president is to have Lapu Lapu declared as national hero. And of course, because kind of, he ran on the whole theme of kind of, it's the turn of the Visaya. So that's the kind of.
Yeah, but when you come to actually, Circumnavigation was really an entry center dito po at that time. A lot of trade was coming through Cebu.
Yeah.
More than Manila was not really malayo po yun. The Chinese were really coming to Cebu, and
yeah, Cebu was an important so besides Mindanao, it would be like kind of major port, Butuan, Cebu. Of course, Manila already was a kind of
but even before Magellan came.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why, like, when Magellan came, Limasawa and so on, like the natives that they encountered were telling them that they should come to Cebu because that's where so because they kind of were interested, of course, in supplies, in stocking up on supplies. So they were directed na parang, well, the parang principal settlement in this region is Cebu. That's why they came to Cebu.
This is
Mm.
question might be left
Mm.
field. I'm not sure. Maybe related to globalization.
Mm.
Kasi at that time it was really expansion, European expansion.
Yeah, yeah.
But today we have a situation where, for example, Trump is
Mm.
in this trade war between China
Mm.
and the U.S.
Mm.
Barriers to trade, and you have Trump interested more in shielding America from,
Yeah, yeah,
from
Yeah.
migrants.
yeah.
You have a situation in the south today, China and
Mm.
other countries. How what if I were a student and there's this commemoration, circumnavigation,
Mm.
the meeting of East and West
Mm.
insofar as the Philippines is concerned.
Mm.
How would you make is I don't know
Mhm.
yung relevance po ng commemoration today in terms of the present? Paano po kaya how would one explain or how would one draw?
Yeah. Kind of. I think that's one of the challenges and what makes it interesting because one can say that parang globalization is a kind of a major phenomenon and it's going to remain. Ang interesting thing of today, can you kind of think about like a clear move, especially because of China, parang to remake the world order. And in fact, it's China, even they're kind of, ano yung tawag nila, belt.
The Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, yeah, it's almost like kind of it's a whole global project as well. But kind of reorienting it away from parang a US kind of dominated. Which means that kind of, I mean, that's a form of globalization, or kind of the kind of that's still going to be the reality. But as to kind of there clearly is a move towards kind of reconfiguring it so that parang the US is no longer the so that kind of the whole idea of globalization is interesting to look at. That's why I said yung my idea is that in the case of the quincentennial, I mean that's an issue that should be prominent for thinking about, parang beyond the kind of strictly past historical part. So I think what I understand is there's a major effort to, in terms of like the global scale of the celebration, that they're forming this network of what they call Magellanic cities, meaning a network of the cities where the Magellan expedition. In fact, there was a meeting here like 2 years ago, where they had like people from South America, but they had I don't know whether what the current status is, but they're parang for economic, cultural exchange, but of course the important thing is that in terms of current realities, how that kind of network is configured, what it consists of, will be different. and of course, a major factor there is the case of China. I mean, that is the major one. Uh, uh, so, kind of it would be a good occasion to think about.
You
The-
an international
Hmm?
conference
Hmm?
along those lines po.
No, I was just kind of citing it as parang if you at one time if thinking about like how the quincentennial would be celebrated, I was saying to some people na yung globalization should be a major theme there because that really should be the major theme. Because I was thinking of like if you want to make it parang ang current relevance instead of just a celebration of parang the history, but if you want to bring it up to the present and probably like get involved the participation of people who may not be that interested in history, especially yung business sector because they're the ones who would be important in terms of like raising the resources for the celebration. I mean, that would be one way of like getting their attention, di ba? So, parang, so, because, like as I mentioned in the article, like when the book on Lapu Lapu that book was never formally launched. Kasi ang launching was supposed to take place in Maktan. It was timed yung annual celebration of the Battle of Maktan, April 27. And yung launching of the book was supposed to take place on the eve of the celebration. And yung Lapu Lapu City government had agreed they were going to host it, although they inserted it into a program where there were other things going on. And then just the day before the launch, they canceled. So it's not. So we're talking na probably ang publisher was saying na probably they parang read part of the book already and they decided they did not want it. This is the kind of book they did not want. But I was saying na probably they just felt na they did not have space for it because they were more interested in yung mga folk dance presentation, the other parts of the program. So.
That was supposed to be last year. Last year po yan.
Oh,
The book launching.
yeah, I think last year. And so, last year or early this year? Basta April.
Early this year.
So,
Si Pacquiao daw yata yung Lapu Lapu.
ha?
Si Manny Pacquiao, Senator Pacquiao.
Ang
Lapu Lapu daw eh. I don't know.
I don't know. I was not paying attention. But I was saying, although I don't make it explicit in the book, I said what would be in a sense parang they will not be happy about is because I took a dig at yung mayor. She's not the mayor anymore, yung si Radasa. Because there was this controversy over the Lapu Lapu monument in Luneta, di ba?
Yes.
The big
Yes.
Lapu Lapu monument.
That's right.
There was a move to move it somewhere else because it's not supposed to be the right place for it, di ba? So I don't know what the status. There was a controversy over the location.
It's still there.
It's still there, no?
Still there.
But when that controversy erupted, like the mayor of Lapu Lapu City publicly offered to the monument will be transferred to Maktan.
Okay.
So, and of course, she was interested in kasi tourist attraction yan.
Yes.
And she said that according to the news report that Lapu Lapu City already has a place for it because they're going to build an artificial island sa Punta Inganyo. Na parang our version of the Statue of Liberty. There was this.
Yeah.
There was that artificial island. There's going to be Lapu Lapu there, na parang like the Statue of Liberty. And monument has Lapu Lapu facing the sea. Kasi he's kind of yung kampilan planted the ground, and parang he is he is ano ba yung title of the monument sa Lapu sa Sentinel of Freedom or something like that, di ba? Sentinel of Freedom. Parang facing the sea against the invaders. So I was commenting. I said, it's going to be very parang ironic or pathetic na if you have that monument in Lapu Lapu. And here's Lapu Lapu standing facing the sea as a sentinel of freedom. Well, behind him, the whole Maktan Island has already been taken over. You know, I mean, U.S. military base during the Vietnam War, site of an export processing zone. All the beaches there are now owned, are all privatized. They're foreign hotels. So what are you talking about? Lapu Lapu standing there guarding his island. His island has already been taken over. So I was, di ba? So parang how sad na what is he defending Lapu Lapu? Parang gateway of parang Maktan export international airport. So parang would be rather a sad thought na Lapu Lapu has already been. So parang that's the whole parang issue of globalization that Lapu Lapu would.
Which you mentioned, it's a story 1930 story when he came back up. When he came back.
Yeah. So I was saying that probably like Lapu Lapu City government would not be happy about sponsoring the launch of the book, because I mean you can understand. I mean, there's local officials are not interested in history. They're interested, of course, tourism. That's the main thing, tourism. No, so. I mean, indeed, like if they transfer that monument to Punta Ingaño, that will be a big tourist attraction. Especially if they poster with a plan that there's going to be a artificial island there where the monument will be placed. So that's what they're interested in.
At this back, that would be the Hilton Hotel.
So.
So surprisingly, for someone, well, at least ngayon, medyo yung statue ni Lapu Lapu. Wala man lang museum or, something that would inform the visitors about what happened, something like that.
Yeah. But I don't know whether even if you go there now, yung marker sa Historical Institute, di ba?
Yes.
Dalawa. There are two markers. The original one and then the one that they changed. I think it's on that, di ba, may shed on, and then doon na lang marker, back to back. Oh. And then I think the original one was really parang the text had something to do with like parang sa circumnavigation, that and this path and then the next one already was like parang fighting foreign invader. Parang so ang point of the original plaque was really to mark the circumnavigation. But the second plaque already was parang about yung resistance against foreign. So there are two actually official plaques there.
Magkaiba pala yun.
Huh?
Dapat hiwalay sila.
Oh, they're just back to back. They're like one side.
One side.
So dalawang kuan. There are two.
Tsaka faded na yung mural.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really taken care of.
Yeah, pero like to begin with, I think yung Lapu Lapu monument there is misplaced.
I agree.
They should have kept the Magellan shrine as is. parang one is parang they should not be put together. Parang it's it should be placed. Magellan, ang Lapu Lapu monument should be placed somewhere else. Kasi also aesthetically, yung parang classical yung style na and then here parang yung yung parang
tinutubuan ng weeds na at
yeah.
wala.
Kasi yung parang there's a clash of style sa dalawang they should separate the two.
That's true.
Oh. So now you have a strange thing about like it's not only that you have the two put together na may clash in symbolism, may dalawang plaques pa na ibang text. That's why like but that's parang that's one problem with respect to yung mga historical commemorations like one of the plaques here. In fact, I wrote an article about it also. Yung oldest street in the Philippines, Colon Street. That's an the plaque is there sa Colon, 1947 yata yung year when that was declared oldest street in the Philippines. In fact, I asked si Maris Joke, now she was the head of the National Historical Institute, about that. Also, I wanted to find out if they have still documents as to how they arrived at that conclusion, the oldest street in the Philippines. Apparently, walang records, and most likely the process at the time probably was not parang it was very informal. Parang walang investigation or may supporting. And see, Maris was saying na they have changed their policy. They no longer declare a street as a historical, any street as a historical site. Kasi parang like why all the street in the Philippines, and then it's parang the way it's worded, it's credited na yung the Spaniards, Legazpi came, parang that was the reason for the. So what are you saying, that there were no streets in the Philippines before the Spaniards came? So but of course they're stuck with it. Parang so that's it's there. So interesting yung parang mga historical commemorations na like sa Maktan, dalawang versions. Okay?
Yes.